Hey everyone, hope everyone's doing well out there. I am going to be recording a series of these lectures, which is going to be, obviously not as interesting or fun as being together in class, but I'm going to try to narrate the slides that I would otherwise be uploading and just kind of give you a sense of what the material is meant to get across. And these are not probably going to be full, hour 15-minute lectures, but they'll be more of kind of a guided tour, blog posts or something that'll at least help you kind of get a sense of what the section's meant to get across and so forth. And wish we could kind of be all together having more of a conversation about this stuff, but hope everyone's out there staying safe and washing hands and social distancing and all that stuff. So just to kind of back up a little bit, so I'll be uploading these as I create them. And then you'll have them as a resource. You'll have the readings. I sent out an email last week about kind of how we're going to proceed with the rest of the material. In terms of, we're going to get rid of the quizzes, knock those off the total possible, and we'll have basically an open book final exam that I will upload during the last week of class, and you can kind of have a week or so to work on that. So again, email me if you have any questions about the material, if you have trouble accessing any of the online stuff. Just give me a heads up and we can try to work on that access issues. All right, so what we want to kind of talk about today is finish up talking a little bit about the Old Kingdom. It's been a couple weeks since we've been together, so just to kind of review the Old Kingdom before the video we watched. We talked about the evolution of pyramids, right? And the video kind of talked about the evolution of pyramids, culminating in the Great Pyramid in the 4th dynasty at the Giza complex, Khufu's pyramid, and his sons Khafre and Menkaure, and some of the patterns we see in the layout of those pyramids and what they mean, and so forth. We talked a bit as well about the ideas about how the pyramids were built, including the different hypotheses, building a large ramp out in front, which is fairly untenable for reasons we discussed. We noted that one of the more reasonable hypotheses is the use of a ramp that kind of wrapped around the pyramid, and that was sort of disassembled as the pyramid was finished, and so that seems to be the most likely hypothesis, but it's going to be difficult to say for sure what the final answer is. The film talked quite a bit about also the town that housed the builders of the pyramids, right? The pyramid town in back of Giza, and Mark Lehner's work since the 90s in kind of excavating this part of the site and helping us understand the conditions of the workers, kind of disproving the notions that it were slaves under the whip that were building the pyramids, as is sometimes commonly depicted in movies and the Bible and things like that. They seem to be a workforce that were sequestered. They may or may not have wanted to be there, but they were sequestered, possibly at times when the river was in flood. There wasn't a lot of work. They were well fed, well taken care of. You need a strong, healthy workforce to build this sort of project, and so that was seems to be what was taking place in the pyramid town. Obviously, it's not someplace most of us would want to work, but they did seem to be well housed and taken care of. A lot of bread, a lot of beer, a lot of meat, and so forth. So that kind of gives us a sense of what life was like in the shadow of the pyramids, and also a sense of what a state-sponsored town looks like. So one thing we didn't have a chance to talk about last week was some of the new texts that emerge at this time, the new sources that we have toward the end of the Old Kingdom. Of course, the Giza pyramids are really kind of the climax of the pyramid construction phase. After that, pyramids continue to be built, but they're just not as large, as impressive. They don't have, sometimes they have rubble cores or mud brick cores, and so forth. And so they're not quite as massive and impressive as the other ones. The new Egyptian state had made its statement, and perhaps was running out of resources. So they're building smaller tombs for the kings, but they do have some interesting features that are worth looking at, including a king named Unas. His pyramid in Saqqara had a feature that is kind of interesting called pyramid texts, and this is a new kind of genre of writing that we have access to. And essentially what these are is a list of spells written inside the walls of the burial chamber that give the king the necessary information to guide his soul through the trials and tribulations and traps of the afterlife. And so these are kind of the walkthrough, if you will. If you play video games, you can go on YouTube and cheat and see the walkthroughs and the clues of how to make it past various levels. Well, this is kind of the Old Kingdom version of that, where the king can use this information to get by the giant snakes and the various monsters that will threaten him in the afterlife. So this is an interesting new kind of text that Egyptologists have resourced to, that kind of tells a bit about cosmology and things like that, and features that we don't see in the Giza pyramids. And throughout the sort of second half or third or so of the Old Kingdom, the waning centuries of the Old Kingdom, we also see increasing power at the local level, which we'll talk about why that might be in a minute. But we can see local administrators, nomarchs, people like that are starting to assert more wealth and power for themselves up and down the Nile. And we see this archaeologically because they are building larger monuments for themselves, tombs for themselves. They are taking on more of the trappings of kingship, prerogatives that the king used to kind of take for himself. In his pyramid, we start seeing those symbols emerge in private tombs. And so, used to have nomarchs and various administrators that were scrambling to be buried near the king's pyramid, right, to kind of show their loyalty to the king and kind of get some of the spoils of that. But we see by the end of the Old Kingdom, tombs are being built in the provinces themselves, kind of like these are being treated as little fiefdoms and little power bases of nomarchs. And so they're not just sort of in near Memphis, near the capital, but in their hometown. So a lot of rock cut tombs, for example, tombs cut into the living rock in various parts of the Nile that take a lot of effort, right? Take a lot of resources. You're seeing symbols inside of these tombs that are usually reserved for kings. So we have, you remember we talked about Serdab statues that are symbols of the king, representations of the king, where he's kind of seated inside of a chapel, looking out a window over his kingdom, and his soul can kind of gaze out the window. And we see these with private individuals as well. On the left here, you can kind of see a private family, an elite family. The father seated, and the wife next to him, and then a child. Even though their child is life-size, you can tell it's a child by what's called the lock of youth, kind of the side lock. It looks kind of like a young Padawan, Jedi Padawan or something. And he's got his finger to his lips, which indicates he's a adolescent or juvenile. And then these other statues that are included in the private tombs that are essentially meant to kind of do the work of the individual in the afterlife. So somebody doing laundry or slaughtering an animal, making food, these sorts of things that somebody wants to maintain their wealthy lifestyle in the afterlife and get these statues to do that kind of work. This is an example of a tomb by a mastaba tomb by a local overseer near a city called Abu Sir in Saqqara, a guy named T, and he has a very large very large mastaba tomb you can kind of see here in the middle, and these will have large false doors that the soul can go in and out of, and this is where offerings would be made, food offerings and so forth, to the soul of the deceased, and you can see him represented with exotic animals, monkeys, things that would have been gotten on trade, exotic trade missions, long-distance trade missions. He's hunting. Sometimes they're using bows and arrows, which is usually reserved for kings, and other sorts of depictions of elite life in their tombs here. These are more scenes from the tea monument in Saqqara, and he's got people overseeing his cattle and all sorts of stuff. So this kind of signals a lot more power going toward local individuals, and eventually this kind of diffusion of power we see kind of culminating in the end of the Old Kingdom, and in a period that we refer to as the First Intermediate Period. I remember the kingdoms are divided into Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom based on the dynasties that Manetto wrote down for us, the 30 dynasties. And in between these major dynastic periods are intermediate periods. And these are not kind of the collapse of Egyptian civilization or even the political system, but they're sort of periods of decentralization. It's not like the empires of Mesopotamia that sort of completely disappear in various periods, like the Akkadian dynasty disappears and then is replaced by a totally different dynasty or different empire. In Egypt, the culture during these intermediate periods, there's three major intermediate periods, kind of, the power is decentralized, but they're still Egyptian, right? They're still, still iconographically, religiously, linguistically, they're still Egypt. It's just kind of a period where power is a little more diffused, uncertainty about who's in charge, that sort of thing. But culturally, it's still Egypt. So in this first intermediate period, there seems to be some political disruption that is marked between the 9th and 11th dynasties. Power bases are competing for power. And so what led to kind of the downfall of the Old Kingdom, there's a number of different things going on, and they all kind of create a perfect storm for the dissolution of power. We see environmentally that there are a series of low Nile floods at this time, resulting in local crises, right? The Nile doesn't flood, food doesn't grow, storehouses aren't filled, taxes aren't paid, and that causes a lot of problems. And there seems to be some indication that that was happening at this time. And in a lot of these crises, as we're seeing with the coronavirus, right, it's the local leaders that seem to be taking the reins and doing a better job of responding to a crisis where the national leadership is sort of floundering. And so what we see in the Old Kingdom then is these leaders are able to respond to local circumstances, and this cements local allegiances, and they're able to kind of take power away from, prestige and power away from the pharaoh, and build those power bases. So there's a weakening of the central state. In political terms, throughout the Old Kingdom, the pharaoh, there was when new lands would be opened, pyramids built, monuments built, a lot of time the land that is used to support those are tax exempt. And so, that's less money being flowing into the national coffers. And the more of these monuments that are built, the more tax exemptions you carve out, the less money is being contributed to the state, right? So that led to kind of economic problems as well. And then finally, you have one of the last leaders of the Old Kingdom, not the last, but one of the last, pharaoh named Pepi II, who, ironically, for a guy named Pepi, lived for about 90-something years, right? He ruled for about 80 years. at the end of the Sixth Dynasty. And this, when you start outliving your heirs, causes succession problems. And so there was a period where had a lot of sort of short-lived kings after that, and that also undermined central authority when people couldn't really determine who was supposed to be in charge. So all of these kind of, some combination of these coalesce to lead to the downfall of a very strong centralized state that the Old Kingdom was. And essentially you have a picture then where, just to kind of, I'm not going to dwell too much on the first intermediate period, lasted about 100 years or so, but essentially you've got two competing power bases, one near the Fayum, near Lower Egypt, at a place called Heracleopolis, another one of those Greek names, and sort of a power center there, and then a traditional power center at Thebes. And these two kind of competing centers finally conflicted, and a king by the name of Mentuhotep in the 11th dynasty from Thebes conquers Heracleopolis and eventually reunifies Egypt. And in doing so, he was, really, he's already deified, but he's really celebrated as one of the great kings that restored Egyptian strength and centrality and so forth later on. His memory kind of lives on. As we'll see, has a really major monument built to him and so forth. So we want to talk about for the remainder of this particular lecture is kind of some characteristics of Middle Kingdom period, and this has, again, there's a lot of continuity, cultural continuity. It's still Egypt, but there are some interesting aspects to the Middle Kingdom, some lessons they learned from this intermediate period and so forth. And some of the monuments begin to change, different kinds of texts emerge and so forth. So we'll talk about that a bit today and continue in our next lecture about the New Kingdom next time. So essentially in the Middle Kingdom, here's a kind of a map of the Nile Valley showing some of the major sites in the Middle Kingdom. The capital of the Middle Kingdom moves again. It's still kind of near the Fayum, near Memphis a bit, but it's in a site that's may have been discovered recently, but its location up to now has been fairly mysterious. But the Egyptians refer to it. It was a new capital established by a pharaoh named Amenemhet the first, and it's called Ichtawe, which means sort of the two lands, referring again to the reunified Egypt. You've also got new funerary complexes of the Middle Kingdom at a site called Lisht, near the Fayum, and more traditional religious centers that kind of remain important. Thebes, Karnak, the famous kind of religious monument, begins to be built around this time, and we see new importance to the god Amun, which is sort of a ram-headed god, and he begins to take on more prominence in Egyptian cosmology, and eventually would be fused with the sun god Re to create Amun-Re, which is still, for the next 2,000 years, is sort of the chief god of the Egyptian cosmology. But you also have Abydos, which we mentioned early on, as since the pre-dynastic has been a very important religious center. And in the Middle Kingdom, the god Osiris, who's kind of king, god of the afterlife, of death, takes on the cult of Osiris, takes on increasing prominence, and this is centered, as it always has been, at Abydos, but it just kind of takes on increasing importance, and so we see new monuments go up to Osiris in Abydos, and so forth. So some new sites take on, old sites take on new importance, new sites emerge, etc. So kind of a reconfiguration of the political landscape. So as we said, Mentuhotep is one of the important founding kings of the Middle Kingdom, and he built a large tomb at a site called Deir el-Bahri, across the river from Thebes. It's actually just, the Valley of the Kings isn't built yet. That's the New Kingdom, but it's kind of in the same kind of complex on the west side of the river as the Valley of the Kings. So this is a very different kind of tomb. It's not a pyramid, nothing like a pyramid. It's sort of this grand courtyard, terraced courtyard with columned halls, and there seems to be evidence of major trees planted in the courtyard. So it's a very different idea than an Old Kingdom pyramid, and still a major tourist attraction today. And later on, we'll talk about Queen Hatshepsut in the New Kingdom, but you can see her monument on the left. She built her mortuary tomb, or her tomb very close to Mentuhotep's, because he's still remembered for a long time as a great leader. So here's some statues of Mentuhotep. It's got pretty big feet, apparently, but a lot of the Middle Kingdom material you can see if you go to the website. I'll try to circulate some museum websites that have some of this material. You can read kind of about the individual artifacts, but the Met in New York, Museum of Fine Arts in Boston has a lot of Middle Kingdom material. And so one of the interesting aspects of the Middle Kingdom also is you still have power and wealth showing up in private tombs, so really wealthy private tombs. And so this tomb here on the cliffs above Deir el-Bahri, we have one of the tombs at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, excavated in the 30s or so, a tomb of a guy named Maketra, who was an official under Mentuhotep. And what's interesting about his tomb is a lot of wooden models. It's kind of a new kind of artifact that we see popping up that gives us a lot of really interesting information. So we talked about some other sources of information in the Middle Kingdom, some of the texts, or not in the Middle Kingdom, all throughout Egyptian history, the king lists, and these sorts of things that give us some clues about what we know about the Egyptian past. And these new models, wooden models, clay models from these tombs, wealthy tombs, give us some really good information about technology, how people went about various tasks and so forth. So here's one model of somebody hoeing the ground. Again, we can see their dress, their hairstyle, what the animals look like, the technology and so forth. That's pretty useful. Here's an example of a couple different examples of bakeries, breweries, and again, these are things that people would want in the afterlife. If you're a wealthy landowner, you want people to make your bread, brew your beer, all these things, right? So we can kind of get a sense of how these things happened, right? So there's a bread oven and people kneading bread, and you can see women doing certain things and men doing certain things, and scribes writing things down, and a lot of kind of useful information. Scribes keeping track of stuff going in and out of the bakery and granary and so forth. So it gives us some cool clues about details about ancient life that are lost a lot of times in archaeological record. Here is an annual event that happens in Egyptian life called the cattle census, and so the overseers would be sitting under a shady spot, and people would parade the king's cows in front, and it's a way of kind of keeping track of land holdings, stuff that the king has, also stuff that local people had to know how much they'd be taxed, and these sorts of things. We can see all sorts of different colors that the cows came in, and different sorts of clothing styles different classes had, and these sorts of things. So kind of a cool amount of detail that we don't have before. So as we noted, Old Kingdom, of course, was the pinnacle of pyramid construction. Pyramids don't disappear in the Middle Kingdom. We don't see them certainly at the same scale. We see them kind of relatively poorly built compared to the Old Kingdom. They don't preserve as well. They're smaller, but they're still important symbols of state power. So they do continue on, as Egypt is unified, they want to kind of reclaim some of these old symbols. So they build pyramids in other spots. But this is an example of a Middle Kingdom pyramid of a king named Senusret II at a site called Lahun. And again, this is sort of a mud brick core. It's not well preserved. You can see it's kind of slumping in the background there. Not terribly impressive, but again, it's the symbol of it is what's important. Built near the capital of Ichtawe, near the Fayum, of course, and a slightly different kind of architectural features where you've got an entrance outside the pyramid and leading to a chamber or leading to a kind of a causeway and so forth. But you have similar sorts of ancillary buildings like mastabas for local officials, the Queen's Pyramid, etc. So some similarities that continue on. And also a pyramid town associated with this pyramid, Senusret's pyramid at the site of Lahun. And again, this is a good example of a state-planned pyramid, or pyramid town, state-planned town, basically. For a long time, it was considered that Egypt may have been a civilization without cities because we don't have major cities like Babylon, Khorsabad, Mari, all these major Mesopotamian cities that survived for centuries. We don't see those large monumental cities in Egypt to the same extent, and so people thought, well, maybe the king has a city, but he's kind of moving around up and down the Nile, and he didn't have sort of a major palace complex. But we do now know that there are cities. They just did not preserve very well because of flooding, and a lot of architecture was torn down to build Cairo in the medieval period. And there's a lot of reasons why we don't see a lot of evidence for cities in the same way we do in Mesopotamia. But one example of a state-planned town is this site of Lahun or Kahun. And again, very well laid out, rectilinear layout, orthogonal, individual houses. You can see differences in class. Actually, Flinders Petrie, I believe, excavated part of this city in the early 20th century. And what's cool about this city is we actually have some papyrus that preserved, including medical papyri in the Middle Kingdom. So we can get a sense. This is an example here showing on the slide of a gynecological papyrus that talks about women's health issues and pregnancy and these kinds of things. And it's written not written in hieroglyphs, obviously. It's written in a different kind of script called hieratic script that we'll talk about a little bit later. But it's sort of the general everyday script that we see things written in. So this is kind of a nice, obvious window into daily life that archaeology itself can give us, and some of the cures for various sorts of things. Other kinds of papyri include veterinary papyri, censuses, and so forth. So this is an interesting version of a Middle Kingdom pyramid town, or a state-planned town. But again, we see the continuation of these private tombs for elites, overseers, wealthy people, etc. And two of the most famous that were excavated also by the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston are Deir el-Bersha and Beni Hassan in the kind of middle Nile Valley. And these were private rock-cut tombs that provide a lot of really interesting information. More of these models of individuals. Here you see a procession. It's called a Bersha procession. It's a provincial governor's tomb, and they're bringing goods to the governor. And again, somebody farming with farm tools, and you see some of the wealth items like a ivory headrest, ivory coming from trade in Nubia and Africa. So a lot of wealth items still accumulating in private hands. Really cool example of this is a provincial governor named Jehuti-Hotep, who in one of his tombs really kind of laid out the process through which some of his statues were built. This is a tomb scene where we get some information. You know, we always kind of like to ask, well, okay, how are the pyramids built, or how are these massive statues built? How do they move them? And we get some information from the Egyptians themselves. And we don't see any alien flying saucers in this scene. We see humans led by other humans, and brute force and hard work and ingenuity used in the construction of these statues and other monuments. So this is an example of Jehuti-Hotep statue, and you can see some familiar, probably, tools and methods. So you have this is, what they probably happened is people at the quarry roughly carved out a likeness of the statue, kind of roughed out the statue, and then you see them moving the statue, the roughly carved out statue, to where they want it to go in the tomb, and you see these registers of humans pulling on ropes, and these in real life would have been a long procession of people, but you can't, the way they're represented historically is through these registers stacked on top of each other. But you can see he's on a sledge, right? Like we saw in the film, these large blocks of stone used to build the pyramids, or other large blocks of stone like this one, were probably moved on a sledge, and you can see the little guy at the statue's feet pouring water on the floor or on the ground, and this would have kind of greased the wheels, so to speak, made the ground moist. There's if they're dragging it over clay, it would have made it a lot slicker, and this kind of helps the sledge move. And once you get break the inertia, you can really kind of move these things, not with too much terrible difficulty, as long as you have enough manpower, which they definitely did. So this is kind of gives us a good window into technology of the time, and how they moved really heavy objects with teamwork. So here is Beni Hassan, another private tomb nearby. Khnum-Hotep is a famous tomb from an administrator in the Eastern Desert, where they had a lot of natural resources, and this is a depiction of a caravan of Asiatic nomads, traders who were bringing goods. You can tell by their hairstyle and their beard style, clothing style, that these are people who are bringing trade items to Khnum-Hotep, or what he's overseeing. And so this is him depicting the bounty of goods that he's helped bringing into Egypt. And you can see really monumental tombs with column bases and these sorts of things. So really elaborate tombs at this time. And another kind of way in which we can see the wealth moving into private hands is the beginning of what we call coffin texts. And so, whereas we saw in the end of the Old Kingdom, or later Old Kingdom, 5th Dynasty and so forth, we see pyramid texts and royal pyramid tombs. Here we see a similar sort of idea, but they are in private coffins. So we know this is a pretty wealthy individual because, first of all, his coffin is made out of sycamore and cedar, and those are very, very expensive, pieces of wood, lumber. And you can tell by the carvings, they're well painted. They are employing, again, symbols of kingship that we don't see outside of royal tombs until the Middle Kingdom, where this, for example, the Wadjet eye, you can see those pair of eyes on the coffins, and these are facing east so that you can watch the sun be reborn every day. And so those are characteristics of these expensive coffins. And again, these are, we'd find these inside the cliff tombs inside their districts and so forth, right? So within these, inside of these coffins, we see texts inside of them that are similar sorts of spells and prayers and trying to help to guide the deceased into the afterlife. Using, you can just sort of have these within the comfort of your own coffin, and so this kind of suggests, well, given the wealth that we're seeing and these kind of cheat sheets to the afterlife that we normally see in royal tombs, we're now seeing in private tombs. This kind of has led some Egyptologists to refer to this as kind of the democratization of the afterlife, in that you've got these royal prerogatives that are trickling down into the private sector. And so democratization of the afterlife is, it is the broadening of use of these symbols, but it's not like everybody has them, right? I mean, you still have to have a certain level of wealth and power to make these tombs, to buy these coffins and whatnot. And so it's still only the very wealthy that are going to have these, right? Instead of the 1%, maybe it's the 2% that can do this, but it's still not something that everybody has access to. In any case, this democratization of the afterlife just refers to a wider circulation of these symbols among the population. So another aspect of the Middle Kingdom, once Egypt is reunified in the 11th dynasty, you see the state starting to reassert its power over local trading partners and access to resources, and kind of reasserting its old kind of dominion. And one signal of that is that Egypt really kind of wants to get back into the international trade game by securing its border with Nubia, securing access to the gold and ebony and really wealth of resources that Africa has to offer Egypt. And so in order to do that, it builds a series of fortresses along the first and second cataracts of the Nile, right? So this is on the Nubian-Egyptian frontier. And this really reflects how important Nubia is. And Nubia is starting to, south of here, starting to gain power with the competing state of Kerma. And so Egypt really is keen on securing its borders. And in the Old Kingdom, trade with Nubia was very important. And in fact, there's a fun passage in the Old Kingdom section of your textbook where one of the governors of this region, Harkuf, is commissioned by Pepi II, the really old king who lived into his 90s. But when he was a kid, he took the throne when he was very young. He was very excited because Harkuf was on a trading expedition to Nubia and had secured a pygmy. And the young king was very excited about this pygmy, and he's writes him a letter to say how much happy he's going to be if this pygmy makes it back alive and healthy, and the rewards that Harkuf will have and the favor that he will have in the eyes of the king, etc., etc. So trading to Nubia has always been a very important thing, and so these fortresses are meant to kind of secure that system. The site of Buhen, the fortress of Buhen, is one example of that, and these are laid out like fortified cities, basically. I mean, they're buttressed, they're thick walls, they're secured with a moat, a dry moat. They've got drawbridges. I mean, just really classic fortresses, and orthogonally planned, big storage facilities, all sorts of features that suggest Egypt is here to stay, right? This is a symbol of Egypt's dominance of the frontier. That's kind of the statement they wanted to make. And the economic importance of this region. So we see a bunch of these fortresses being built, and guard station, battalions stationed in them, and so forth. So another thing the Middle Kingdom is known for is as a period of classical literature in Egypt. It's really kind of the golden age of Egyptian literature. and later periods reflect on this, and we see a lot of examples of this in papyrus and other sorts of media. And part of it is the unusually personal nature of the literature, where you see people reflecting on kind of intangible aspects of life. They're kind of philosophical questions, and some of them even writing about things like suicide or or loyalty or heartbreak, or you really get a sense that after the first intermediate period, if it's not reading too much into it, you get a sense that Egypt understands that it is a fragile thing. It's not inevitable that it's going to last forever, that kings are vulnerable, and this is kind of reflected in the writing. So, there's a piece of literature called The Instructions of Amenemhet, where he talks to his son Senusret and reflects on a dream that he had, that you need to be careful of your viziers, your overseers. People may be disloyal to you, and he'd lived through assassinations and these sorts of things. So he had some firsthand knowledge of this. So he was kind of giving some instructions of his son to his son that suggest this level of vulnerability that you don't really see in other parts of Egyptian history, where it's all bluster and so forth. So this is another pretty famous tale, the tale of Senuhe, that kind of an interesting story about somebody who flees Egypt after the death of Amenemhet I, spends most of his life in Palestine and his kind of homecoming to Egypt and so forth. So as you can see, this is not written on a papyrus scroll. It's written on what looks like a sort of broken piece of slate or stone or even pottery. And this is a medium that is referred to as an ostracon. And this actually comes from the Greek term ostracon, where people would use a broken piece of pottery or something to vote out a rich person who's getting too powerful. That's where we get the term ostracized from. But ostracon in Egyptian context is that same sort of broken piece of pottery that you can write on. But in this case, they're using it as sort of a piece of scrap paper where their students would practice writing out stories, math problems, whatever. It's like your sheet of notepaper. And there's a lot of broken pieces of stone and potsherds lying around, so those would be used as kind of scrap paper. And so we see those sorts of things with manuscripts on them, texts on them. And so here's another example of that. You can again see these aren't necessarily in formal hieroglyphics; they're in other kinds of writing systems, right? Another kind of famous tale, the tale of the eloquent peasant, which is the story of farmer, trader, kind of a peasant guy who's wandering around, and he is disabused of his goods and his donkey, and a local overseer accuses him of being a thief and confiscates his goods. And the king, he appeals to the king to have his goods restored, and he's so eloquent, he's so poetic that the king keeps putting him off. He wants him to keep talking because he has such a beautiful voice or beautiful way of speaking. And so it's just kind of an interesting story. And he finally lets him go and restores his goods, but it's kind of a famous tale. And again, not sort of dealing with Nile floods or this or that, just kind of dealing with stuff of everyday life. So yeah, literary traditions are a famous part of the Middle Kingdom as well. So after the 14th, 15th dynasty, or the 14th dynasty, we see the Middle Kingdom come to an end as well in the beginning of the Second Intermediate Period, which is again another century of sort of decentralized power, a divided rule. The north and the south are at odds. And in this case, we have foreign incursions, at least according to Egyptian history. They see foreign invaders from Eastern Mediterranean, a Syro-Palestinian origin, called the Hyksos. And the Hyksos is kind of a bastardization of an Egyptian term meaning rulers of foreign lands. And these are essentially kind of Syro-Palestinian, Eastern Mediterranean folks who set up a foreign dynasty, the 15th dynasty, at a site called Avaris in the Eastern Delta. And this is the first time we see non-Egyptians ruling as pharaohs in Egypt. So, according to Egyptian lore, these were just sort of, hated enemies that come in and usurp power and set up a whole kind of system on their own. But more likely that they've been trading with these people for a long time. Much like the nomads in Mesopotamia, where they're in the written texts are treated as non-urban, uncivilized, savages. When we know archaeologically that they've been interacting with the cities on and off for a very long time. In the same sense here, the Hyksos had been in the Delta for quite some time as traders and whatnot. They just sort of rose into power. But in any case, they establish a dynasty in the Delta, and you have more traditional rulers in Thebes that make up the 16th dynasty that are kind of going essentially simultaneously. As well as this kingdom that is emerging, I mentioned earlier, in Nubia called Kerma, that is gaining a lot of power, the sort of bottom circle there. And the Kerma dynasty is has ambitions to spread into up the Nile Valley, or down the Nile Valley, and try to conquer Egypt as well. And they are in cahoots with the Hyksos in the Delta, and they basically are, communicating with each other through trade routes through the desert between the oases, and are trying to conspire to basically squeeze the dynasty in Thebes and kind of sandwich them and crush them. And one of the Egyptian leaders in Thebes intercepts their communiques and their spies, and thwarts their plans. And eventually the 17th dynasty in Thebes begins to push out the Hyksos rulers in the Delta, and begins the process of reunifying Egypt after the second intermediate period. So this is a fairly long process. There wasn't sort of an epic battle where you see a couple of different dynasties really trying to push back against the Delta, kick out the Hyksos. The first campaigns were begun again by a leader named Sekenenra Ta, who really kind of gave it his all, but as you can see, took a pretty serious beating along the way. He met a violent death he's got sort of axe wounds, hatchet wounds, and spear wounds, and all sorts of stuff in his skeleton. His mummy shows that he was soundly defeated in his first round, trying to push the Hyksos out. But eventually they were successful. His son Kamos pushed into Avaris, the capital, conquered or pushed into the Delta as well. But it was only one of his other sons, Amos, the first in the 18th dynasty, that succeeded in conquering Avaris. So you can see it was a long process. I mean, there's 20 years or so to push out the Hyksos, beats them back, takes over the Delta, and then continued into Palestine, and really just sort of he's pissed. He pushes the Hyksos, chases them all the way up the Mediterranean coast, and then pushes down into Nubia again, and establishes essentially what is the beginning of Egyptian imperial era, up from the Mediterranean coast down into Kush, that will really kind of take us into the new kingdom and the imperial era of Egyptian rule. So that is kind of what I wanted to cover today. Hopefully you have a chance to sort of pause here and there if you have questions or want to look things up, since I don't really have a chance to stop and answer questions for you. But again, do email me if you have questions about how the semester is going, etc. And we'll continue in the next lecture, which I'll upload later this week, about the new kingdom. All right, talk to you soon.